Okay. There we go. All right. Well, before I introduce today's speaker, Ms. Beth Garza, we'll talk about the two talks that are upcoming. And I suppose before I do that, maybe I'll just welcome everyone back to the campus here for the fall 2024 semester. This is the 13th or 14th year of the University of Texas Energy Symposium. So it's good to get started again here. And before I introduce our speaker for today, I'm Kerry King, Assistant Director of the University of Texas at Austin's Energy Institute and a research scientist here on campus. And thank you all for joining us today live in the room and online as well. As I mentioned before, this is this new way for students on campus to get active in events about energy and perhaps to get rewarded by some sort of to be determined prizes for UT Energy Week. Must be present, earn prize, I think. So this is the energy events punch card, and also on the side of the room, there's also the same QR code that you can look at. Next week and the following week after that, we'll have a talk. Next week is by Benji Backer. He is the founder and executive chairman of the American Conservation Coalition, and he will give a talk based on his book, The Conservative Environmentalist. So we can hear about his book and when he expresses there. September 17th will be a UT Austin researcher, Fred Plossman, in the Department of Chemical Engineering, and he does research on CO2 capture. So we will hear about carbon dioxide capture, lowering the risk of commercialization. So a bit on that. But today it's my pleasure to introduce Beth Garza. Beth Garza is, has maybe all of the knowledge that I hope to acquire about electricity markets and regulation and why things work and why things don't. And that's what she's going to tell us about today. So amongst other things, so her current position is a senior fellow with an energy and environmental policy team of the R Street Institute. She'll tell us a little bit about what they do, but a nonprofit, nonpartisan public policy research organization engaged in policy research. But prior to doing that, she served as the director of the Electric Reliability Council of Texas, or ERCOT's independent market monitor from 2014 to 2019. So she was helping make sure everything was going well in the ERCOT market. No companies had too much market power and all the rules were working, and she can know all the acronyms, I think. 40 years career in the electric utility industry. She's had a variety of leadership roles in transmission planning, generation planning, system operations. So if it's out there keeping the grid going, she's seen it happen. So today we're going to get her, I think, a lovingly brief title. I love it, Electric Paradigms. So we're going to hear about the things that people say about how the electric grid should work, should be arranged, and what works well, and what doesn't work well from her host of knowledge. So with that said, I will stop talking and let's welcome Beth Garza.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. I'm happy to be here. We're going to talk about electricity. Electricity in a variety of ways. Kerry was humming around about what, who am I, what is my expertise? And really I've just been around a really long time in the electricity space, primarily here in Texas. But what I'm going to talk about today is, I thought would be a good, since Kerry sort of lined me up early in the semester, what I'm going to lay out is electricity paradigms, how the electricity markets, or not even markets, but an industry, electricity industry is structured and how it's structured differently across the country and what that may mean or the implications of that, of those different kinds of structure. This is a helpful talk for me since I'm so ingrained in the ERCOT world. And I'm hoping that it'll be helpful for y'all as you take this foundation and kind of figure out the branches or the directions that you want to go. Let me start with a basic question. Raise your hand if you pay your own electricity bill. Gosh, thank you. All right, very good. Raise your hand if you understand your own electricity bill. Okay, all right. Just, there's no right or wrong answer, just a random question to get us going. I will say at the outset that all of this work was done by my colleagues. So I'm just standing up here talking about it. And that's the secret of success, is find people to do work and then just stand and talk about it. Where am I pointing?
It's down. It's down.
There it is. All right. I think Carrie read this off. R Street is a DC-based think tank with, you know, efficiencies through markets, basically, through a variety of perspectives. And I'm part of the electricity and energy team. So these paradigms, where does this come from? We have if you were to look at, and we're going to look across the country and you know, if anybody is aware of the Texas ERCOT structure, it's always described as unique, and it is unique in a variety of perspectives. But most of the country, or a lot of the country, has gone through change from, you know, what started at, I'm going to say, you know, if you go back 100 years in the electric utility, I'm not that old, but you go back 100 years, and a lot of the technology is the same. And a lot of it, we understood the physics, we understood how it moved at that point. The regulatory structure sort of came into being in the aftermath of the 20s and monopolization, and we realized, oh, we need to kind of limit the monopolies that were growing around the electricity industry. And that kind of stayed in place for the next 50, 60 years. And then as throughout society, a variety of industries were deregulating: airlines, trucking, but the phone system, the natural gas system, were all examples that the electricity deregulation were looking at and saying, hey, these guys have done it. Here's some benefits that, you know, we don't have to be completely regulated all the way through. Different parts of the US reacted and responded in different ways to that move. And that's left us today with sort of a mishmash of structures across the country. And part of what comes with that then is, particularly in our perspective, we deal with folks around the country, and there's kind of this misunderstood language that evolves, this idea that, well, if you have an RTO, regional transmission organizations, the ERCOT equivalent, 5 or 6 others of those in the country, if you have an RTO, then you must be deregulated. And that's not the case in much of the country. You have an RTO over the top of regulated, fully bundled utilities. Misunderstood results. What causes customer rates to change? That's why I asked you if you guys paid your own bills. What are the drivers of those rates that you're paying? And if you get me on a tangent, I'll go off on it. So I'll warning now on rates and what I see for kind of rates and how they'll be structured going forward. And then the context, this difference between wholesale and retail deregulation. And when I use those terms, does everybody understand the difference between wholesale and retail, right? Wholesale is when you buy kind of in bulk to sell to the end use consumer. And I would argue that I don't care what you're selling, whether it's electricity or shoes or Cheerios, the hardest part of any transaction is that retail final customer transaction. And I think we've seen that in the retail competition world of electricity. So we have these different combinations of wholesale deregulation and retail deregulation under the guise of various RTO structures. And so what we're left with, and what my colleagues have kind of lumped into 3 main paradigms. And there's some key differences within this, and the map here is helpful as well. If we talk about sort of the traditional, you know, what existed 50, 60, 70 years ago, monopoly, investor-owned utilities without any kind of RTO. These are closed structures, if you will. They are companies that in some cases are very profitable and very valuable. NextEra is one of those companies who has a very large bundled regulated utility that serves most of Florida. No, I'll stop there. The lot of the West remains fully bundled utility. Part of that is it's sparser. Part of that is you have federal power authorities and you have cooperatives that are good at serving those sparse areas. And so that in and of itself, you know, the structure of the utility space in Georgia versus Texas is very different. And what that means in terms of who you would have to go to try to get a project built, or to encourage somebody to invest in your project, or try to find a customer that you might want to work with, those structures are very, very different. I'm going to go down to the bottom, the restructured world with competitive retail and generation. And you see that kind of lumped, you know, Texas is the big one right in the middle, but then I'd call it the Northeast markets, if you will, which Illinois is colored green, as the state is fully restructured, but the RTO boundaries are not state boundaries. And so that creates a different dynamic. The Chicago is different than downstate Illinois. Missouri, where I'm a native from, Missouri is in, as we are, because of the middle of the country, the state of Missouri is split between two RTOs. And with different multiple state, you know, decision-making on either side, east or west. So the benefits of Texas are always that we're big and we're resource rich. The size and scope of the Texas market is large enough to support and sustain it as it's, you know, on its own, if you will. In terms of size, if you were to compare Texas to, I always like to do this to my New England friends, the New England ISO, which is 6 states, and their total size, you know, electricity demand and consumption is about a third to a half of Texas on its own. And they have very different requirements, issues, demands. Hybrid is this hybrid structure in the middle, if you will, is those RTOs, those regional transmission organizations, overlaid on top of fully bundled utilities. And that creates some different dynamics and different incentives when we talk about markets and market structure. And I hope to hit on some of those with you today as well. The key regions with that structure, that hybrid structure, are generally the Mid-Continent ISO and the Southwest Power Pool. Yeah, I'll just leave it that. I'll just mention the 2 other single state RTOs are California and New York. 2 states whose politics couldn't be any more different than Texas. But in some respects, particularly California, Texas is moving more and more toward California-like decisions in our electricity market, which I just find completely ironic, and giggle at all the time, and think if our politicians knew that they were doing that, they may have thought of a different path. But that's another story. So as we talk about these different structures, these different kinds of ways things are set up, I and really my colleagues, can't take any credit for it, my colleagues have laid out sort of 4 criteria, 4 dimensions to talk about this electric system, what it provides, the incentives and disincentives that may exist. And those 4 dimensions: reliability, economics, the environmental implications, and governance. And governance is a really interesting aspect that Ms. LBJ School of Public Power, the governance aspect of these structures is interesting and impactful. So let's talk about reliability most. first, we all want electricity and we want it all the time. But from a customer's perspective, let me ask you this. In the last year, who has had the electricity, who has been subject to an interruption of electricity that they did not anticipate? Half the class. Okay. Well, the average is everyone suffers about one interruption a year. Now, is that because we don't have enough power plants producing supply? No, more likely it's because somebody ran into the pole that's holding the transformer that's feeding your house. There's a difference between not having enough supply and the wire and the delivery system to your premise or where you're trying to consume being interrupted. And the effects on those outages are very, very different. We're going to come back to resource adequacy in a minute because that measures the overall availability of supply. But from a customer perspective, we are way more subjected to interruptions on the distribution system, what I refer to as the small poles and wires. You may live in a neighborhood where you don't even see poles or wires because they're underground, but the small delivery system is what is most typically being interrupted in a way that causes you to not have electricity. And just from this is data from the, where's it from? National, NEL, National Electric Labs. Or NREL, National Renewable Energy Lab. The blue part of these bars are those normal distribution types of outages. Car runs into a pole, transformers overload because the 4 customers serving them are all trying to use too much electricity at the time. Overloads, normal kinds of things that generally, here's the important part, that generally can be repaired within an hour. Switch the distribution system, you roll a truck out to replace a piece of equipment. Those kinds of disruptions are very short and easy to maintain, and the structure and the work structure is set up to do that. The orange part is still distribution outages, but related to kind of major events. That if anybody was in Austin, 2.5 years ago now for the Christmas ice storm that took down all the trees, that would be declared, that is a type of a major event. Even the barrel interruptions in Houston were mostly distribution related, trees on small wires, right? That this data doesn't go out that far, but that's the kind of major interruption that would be in those orange bars. The lack of supply is that little bit of silver at the top. And these are measured in, on the left side is interruptions per year. And so that's where I say, generally, a customer is subject to like 1 interruption a year. The key part is the duration that's in the right, on the right graph. And you can see, and some people would call that that a trend. The older I get, the less I'm inclined to draw trends. But you can see some variation between 200 and almost 200 minutes. So what is that? That's almost 3. What is that? That's 3+ hours to almost 5 hours of interruption. And a lot of that is driven by those sort of unusual distribution major events. That's the ice taking down all the distribution lines, or all the distribution lines. So, big question: does Winter Storm Uri prove that restructuring fails at reliability? I would argue no. It certainly had catastrophic consequences here, but the core. And this slide I stole specifically from my colleagues who said, except maybe incentives for power plant weatherization. The incentives for power plant weatherization certainly were improved in the aftermath of Uri. That is, penalties of $1 million a day if you fail, and stricter rules around what it was. there was some belief that power plants were not winterized, and I challenge that. I have challenged that to anybody who brings that up. I think every power plant took actions prior to winter, prior to Winter Storm Uri. Their actions were insufficient. One of the problems with winterization is you can't build a big freezer around the power plant and test to see what's going to freeze. You have to wait until it gets cold, and then you find what your weak spot is. And through the years, then you figure out, oh, well, if it failed here, then I need to look for that kind of situation in my power plant and everybody else's power plant. That's the kind of situation that we're dealing with. So I'm happy to talk some more about that. Other issues in terms of Uri, as a 40-year electricity industry person, I lay it clearly at the feet of the natural gas industry. And although that's not what the natural gas industry would say. But there is a little bit of evidence that shows that the competitive generators, that is generators owned in ERCOT by entities who have no guaranteed revenue stream other than what they can get in the market, performed better than power plants that were in regulated entities and were subject to the same weather. There's a little bit of data on here. And really that conclusion comes from the two solid lines, the blue versus the orange, kind of the lower part of that graph. This is, what is that? That's, it's sort of hourly data across the February of 2021, that Uri duration. And you're looking at the total percentage of outage of the different types of fleet. And you can see that the monopoly utilities, the orange, had a little higher outage rates. Was that luck of the draw? Was that location? I'm not sure there's a clear picture there, but there's certainly an incentive, if your only source of income is, there's no other guaranteed source of income than to produce when prices are higher than your cost to generate, then you have every motivation to try to be generating during this. And if you're a regulated entity that has a guaranteed cost recovery structure, although utility folks as a whole are generally motivated for the public good and, power all the time and go to heroic efforts to try to make that happen, the financial incentives are just a little different. Yeah, Gary.
Yeah, it's like the cooperatives would be included in the monopoly line here.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and I think that's the outlier. They took out that dotted orange line is a monopoly outlier that is not included in the orange. So even taking them out, there was still a little bit worse.
They won't mention.
Yeah.
They are.
Yeah. So that's the going the wrong way. So reliability issues have occurred in all across the country in a variety of ways and all kinds of structures. Winter Storm Elliott, which was last December, affected the southeastern utilities, primarily investor-owned utilities, the Duke and Southern Company. TVA, Texas Valley Authority, which is a federal power authority, had to have their first rolling outages ever since their creation. In their 100-year history, they'd never had to force customers offline, and they did in response to extreme weather. So weather is a challenge across all paradigms and all and the incentives and the actions and the different structures can be different in support of that. The one thing I will say for RTOs is because, we talk about a regional transmission organization. What does that mean? I think of it as and you may have heard the analogy, it's the air traffic controller. Well, how do you be an air traffic controller for electricity? Well, you have data that's being presented to people and systems on an ongoing real-time basis that allows you to see which power plants are producing, what are the loadings on all the transmission lines, running contingency analysis on a real-time basis to ensure that even with the unexpected loss of an element, you can still reliably serve electricity. All of that's happening in the control room of an RTO, ERCOT, and these other organizations. And their footprint is broader than any single entity. And with that broader look, they have that data and that visibility that doesn't exist, or certainly didn't exist prior to the existence of RTOs, where utilities on their own individually were trying to deal with it. If you read some of the trade press around Winter Storm Elliott and the Southeast utilities and what they were trying to do to, how did they were looking at each of their own entities and seeing, oh my gosh, my load is crazy, I don't have enough supply. And literally they're having to call their neighbors to ask if they have some. And that those phone calls become then kind of a daisy chain. Duke calls Virginia, who calls, further north into Pennsylvania to try to see if there's power that can flow down. Much less, and I would argue less reliable way of trying to have stuff. Yeah.
One question online, just open up a can of worms, so you can
Okay.
pause it to the end or not,
Okay.
but it's about events, winterization of gas supply, let's just say, for example, in Winter Storm Uri. So any thoughts about speed? That's the question. Should it be compensation for power plant gas supply security and electric market design, or do you have a recommendation for how we should govern pricing of natural gas, or if we can during emergencies, severe emergencies?
Yeah.
That's a big can of worms. So.
It is a big can of worms, but I'm gonna take the bait. I'm gonna take a little bit of the bait. So a couple of things. I'll just mention that, as we've talked about sort of deregulation of a variety of industries across the US society in the 70s, 80s, 90s. One of those I said was the natural gas industry. Well, that was the natural gas industry regulated at the federal level. So pipelines that cross state lines. The Texas natural gas industry is, I would argue, completely unregulated from a price reliability concern. Presumably, the Railroad Commission is looking at orphan wells and trying to keep bad things from happening to us underground. But they have no requirement or interest in oversight of the natural gas industry. And unfortunately in Texas, a very large percent, I'm going to say 80, but don't hold me to that number, 80% of the power plants in Texas are connected to intrastate pipelines. And so what does that mean? That means that when I have, if I want to build a new power plant, and if I want to connect to an intrastate pipeline, the way I get service is I have to go negotiate a deal. I have to negotiate a deal with a monopoly provider. That doesn't seem, like I'm going to get a good deal out of that. That monopoly provider who controls not only the supply, the molecules in the pipe, but the pipe itself. That dual combination of we allow gas companies intrastate pipelines in Texas to have supply and transport responsibilities without any kind of code of conduct or separation. It's the same people making those decisions, sets us up for them to economically withhold because it's in their interest. That's where we're at right now. Generally not an issue because we generally have more gas than we know what to do with. But at those times when we don't have enough gas, times like extreme winter storms, when household heating demand is up and gas power plant demand is up, it just creates really bad incentives. Now, if I were queen of the world, we would at minimum adopt federal-like restrictions in Texas. Not gonna happen. Yeah, as long as there's a person who's either of the persons whose last name is Craddock in politics, it's not gonna happen. So put that out there, and maybe you young folks will make that happen at some point when I'm, in the retirement home and don't understand any of it anymore. But that's my take on the gas issues. There was part more to that question, but that's what I wanted to rant on.
There's a follow-up, I think, go ahead.
Okay. Anything else on reliability stuff? I'm gonna move on to economics. So, and the economics of restructuring, of this introduction of competition, it's complicated. So the answer is always complicated. Restructuring was supposed to, was billed as a cost reduction effort that, improved competitiveness, would drive out inefficiencies and thereby lower people's rates. That's a hard thing to show that happened or didn't happen, because depending on the time frame that you look at or the geographic area you look at, you get different kinds of answers. Certainly restructuring achieved efficiency in generation operations and investment retirement decisions. Using an ERCOT example, the speed, it's not always market entry, it's as much about market exit. If your crappy old gas unit is uneconomic, you're not going to make money in the market, the incentives in ERCOT are very powerful to retire that unit and get it offline. Those incentives don't always exist in other types of systems where there may be a regulated rate of return on some of that investment and some of that capital. Although you think it's 50 years old, how can there still be investment? There's ongoing capital investment that earns rate of return, or there's allocations that make it look as if that's happening. Some of those units, I've heard colleagues refer to those as zombie units, who never do anything except under the threat of extreme weather. They sort of rise from the dead and try to operate. Sometimes they're successful, sometimes not. In ERCOT, we've had a very clear history of, my parlance, crappy old gas units retiring quickly and efficiently. Right at the onset of the competitive market at the turn of the century, there was just a wave of gas units, old gas units whose efficiencies were not competitive with the new wave of generation, and they retired, they went away. We're dealing with some of that now, ongoing now. If you pay attention, San Antonio has some, I would call them crappy old gas units. I said that to their face, so I don't think I'm offending them. They have three old inefficient gas units that they would like to retire. They have planned for them to retire. Unfortunately, they're in a really key and important location for the transmission system, and so we're in the middle of a debate about whether they should continue to exist or not. Back to economics, so wholesale competition in hybrid areas shows mixed results. Part of that, I think, is because the incentives for, hybrid areas, what is that? You've got an RTO, that means you have a market and you have these fully bundled utilities that are bidding in their marginal cost to produce. But what is their marginal cost to produce? Because they have this guaranteed rate recovery on the backside, right? And so those incentives aren't as clear and aren't as specific in those hybrid areas. And I think that makes for a harder comparison to make. One thing that restructuring it does is it really has provided more opportunities for demand management programs, more it's opportunities for kind of new businesses and business structures to interact with markets. PJM has a whole slew of demand response providers that are active participants in their capacity market. They get paid to then contract with end use customers to shut off at certain times. So those kinds of structures are the incentives for that. I'm not gonna spend any time on this chart because it's old and it attempts to show that, competitive jurisdictions have had cost savings over this period of time. This was an old period of time. Let's see, it's covering it. I think it went to 2016. Yeah, so 2016. So we've had many years since then, and I would argue if you did the same chart now, you'd see different results. I think part of that comes from the, whoops, I keep flipping the wrong way. Part of that shows, that's the academic research shows a little bit of difference. Texas may have had some benefits, but in other regions, they were confronted by their own constraints and their own cost limitations that, a wholesale market was not able to overcome. What do I mean by that? In New England, New England pays some of because they are so far remote from natural gas, and none of you are old enough to remember the 70s when, the mantra was the Texas mantra was we're gonna let the Yankees freeze in the dark. The transportation of gas from where it is to where they need it is constrained and is still constrained 50 years later, and therefore high priced. And that high priced natural gas as a driver of their electricity prices hasn't changed as they've moved to competition. It's still an underlying cost driver. The one aspect of retail competition that I'll point out is retail competition. Let me ask the question. Everybody paid an electric bill. Is everybody here in Austin, or has anybody got a competitive electric provider? Raise your hand if your provider of choice is a competitive retail electric provider. Everybody lives in Austin. Everybody lives in Austin, that's fine. So think about you don't think about your cell phone because your parent pays for your cell phone. Hell, I still pay for my adult children's cell phones. So, but your cell phone, or your coverage, if it's a regulated rate, there's a regulatory process that has to go through, and it takes a while for those rate changes to materialize. And some of the timing of those rate changes, Cameron at Austin Energy, have been problematic. They've waited too long, and then all of a sudden it's a big jump. With competitive suppliers, they're trying to sign up customers every day on an ongoing basis. They're losing customers, they're gaining customers, and every day is a different perspective on what the cost to serve that customer is going to be. And as prices rise, the rates that they're going to, charge their customers are going to rise. As they decline, competitive pressures are going to, sort of drive those down as well. So one of the trade-offs, I don't know that it's good or bad. It depends on which way the underlying drivers of costs are moving, right? If those underlying drivers are driving prices down, customers benefit by fast changes, rapid changes to those conditions. If the underlying things are driving costs up, customers benefit by the slow roll process that'll catch up eventually. So that, there's no good or bad to it. It's just a characteristic. Okay. I'm going to skip, those are the two that I wanted to spend the most time on, was the liability aspect and the economic aspect. I'm going to talk about the environmental aspect, and basically everybody's gotten better environmentally. This chart is some work that Josh Rhodes here at UT and his colleagues did. And basically it's showing that over these 15 years of aggregate emissions across the various RTO levels, they've all declined. Even here in ERCOT, which is that open orange dotted line at the top, even in ERCOT, our emissions have declined over that period of time. And I would argue that's not, it's not because of, and in some respects, in spite of state policy. If you look at the states at the regions at the very bottom, I see ISO New England is the yellow squares. At least 4 of those 6 states have very clear and very significant decarbonization and environmental goals. Next one up is New York ISO. New York has a very clear, very significant decarbonization goals that those regions are responding to. So what I like to, this is my chart and I always like to show it, but it is, you might ask, well, why is ERCOT getting cleaner without any driving force or motivating to do that? And it's the changing resource mix. You see the squeezing gray in the middle is the amount of electricity on an annual basis coming from coal. I look at this chart, and if you kind of look at the top of that gray line as it goes across, all of our growth since, 20 years, all of that growth has on aggregate been met by renewable energy, wind and solar. We may start to see some energy from, well, you can't see energy from, you want to see energy from storage, but if you were to look at this on a capacity basis, you might see some capacity contribution from storage at some point. Not there yet, but I think its time is coming soon. So, ERCOT is, I'm not sure how much of the RTO competitive nature is driving the economic cleanup or the environmental cleanup versus how much of it is just reflecting the regions in which they're operating. But I'll leave that to your own perspective. I do want to talk about governance because these RTOs have an interesting and varied governance, and it's an interesting challenge. All structures share some governance, and it's the feds. The feds have regulatory authority over the transmission lines, big poles and wires. States have regulatory authority over the cost recovery of the small poles and wires. In Texas, ERCOT specifically, the state does all of that. And does it make a difference? These RTOs, particularly multi-state RTOs, raise a challenging governance issue. If you're PJM overseeing utilities in, I think it's 13 or 14 governmental jurisdictions, and so the utilities have to be responsive to those states for some of their costs, but then trying to plan in a regional way that's not quite federal and more than the states has become problematic. It is one of the issues with transmission and transmission expansion in the rest of the country. This allocation or this direction, if you will, is so simple here in Texas for the reasons we're not synchronously connected. So when we plan the transmission in Texas, we don't have to worry about what anybody else is doing because the power that flows in and out is scheduled and controllable. So we don't worry about that. The state legislature through the Public Utility Commission is the only authority that ERCOT then is responsive to. And they are very responsive to it and increasingly responsive to those political and regulatory oversights. Even New York, the New York ISO, right? Same thing. It's a state entity. The ISO has to be responsive. They are very responsive to their governor and legislature. But the electric system, because it's synchronously connected to the east to New England and the west to PJM, they can't ignore the flow through and the real effects of electricity and how it works. So it becomes a more challenging problem, similarly with California as well. So I think to wrap up, the competitive structures do benefit customers. They do it. It's this natural monopoly does not exist for generation or retailing. We used to think it did, and it doesn't for those pieces of the pie. I think the natural monopoly still exists for transmission, big poles and wires, and distribution, small poles and wires. But we'll see how that evolves going forward. And then the benefits that actually flow to customers, as always, are very sensitive to how the specific decisions are made in the regions. And I think that's it. So if you're interested in the full paper, there it is. It's, I think, really well written. But I'm happy to talk about anything else. Yeah, Ken.
Yeah, so you said our state policymakers were maybe kind of inadvertently copying some policy from ISO. I was wondering if you could go into a little more detail.
Oh, I would love to. Thank you for asking that. I didn't even want to. So in California, let me just say, I'll start with California. In California, and it really since the energy crisis of the early 2000s, and I'm not going to go into that, really all generation additions in California have been subject to and have received they've been projects awarded by the state. That's what I'm trying to say. The state, as a central planner, has decided, I want this type of generation, and I'm going to put out an RFP to find projects to meet that type of generation. Now, in California, that type of generation has generally been solar and storage. And that those have all been, and that's the kind of units that have been added. Similarly, here in Texas, our state leaders have decided we need dispatchable natural gas. And we're going to spend, at this point, $5 billion of the multiple billions of state surplus that existed to do loan guarantees for those types of resources. And we're going to basically issue a solicitation and award winners out of that solicitation. We're in that process right now. Just the Thursday, right before the weekend, the Public Utility Commission announced a list of, I forgot the numbers. It's 5 gigawatts. No, it's almost 10 gigawatts of projects that will proceed forward to due diligence. So, but this concept of the state knows what the system needs and is going to put its finger on the scale to get the resources that it wants, is very much in play here.
All right, I have a couple of questions online and try to hybridize together. They're kind of roughly, one's sort of historical looking, one's forward, but similar concept. So generically, let's say there's different customers that pay different rates for themselves, commercial, industrial, residential rates. So at least in ERCOT, have you seen the difference, or do you believe any studies of differences between whether residential rates have gone up or down versus commercial rates going up or down? The argument here being restructuring is mainly to lower the rates for commercial, industrial customers, and retail residential customers suffer disproportionately. And then the forward-looking question is about data centers and artificial intelligence.
Yeah,
loads.
hold that question.
Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, let me talk about the rate differences. In the old days, and continuing on, when there's a regulated rate making process, there's ongoing tensions between the costs to serve different customers. And that tension generally evolves into two camps. And you think about residential consumers, I'll think in two dimensions at least. Residential consumers don't use a whole lot of energy, but by God, they use a lot of demand. When we want to be cool, we want to be cool. When we want to be hot, we want to be hot. And that creates a very spiky kind of demand to serve. The other problem with residential consumers is in aggregate, not pointing fingers at anybody, in aggregate, residential consumers don't pay their bills. I mean, residential consumers can be tough credit risks. Versus industrial consumers that use a whole lot of energy. But it's generally, which is why I want to hold the thought on the Bitcoin and data center stuff, generally kind of flat, or at least that's been the argument. And that tension between the various costs to serve customers has historically been the tension between those two types of customers and what costs should be allocated on an energy basis and what costs should be allocated on a peak basis. That tension, it doesn't go away. And when you look at a rate, residential consumers are going to pay a much higher rate on a per kilowatt hour basis than an industrial consumer. But the real challenge, I think, or the real comparison for residential consumers is bills. Don't use very much electricity, it doesn't matter if you're paying 20, 30 cents a kilowatt hour. If you use a lot of electricity, it matters a lot whether you're paying 4.5 versus 5 cents a kilowatt hour. That's the nature of the argument. So, and that's what makes these kinds of comparisons of who's benefited challenging to make for me in a compelling manner. The other one of the key aspects, and I'll morph into the sort of the big changing industrial demands.
You gotta let me ask a question.
Okay, go ahead.
The question is, does it potentially have an effect, let's just say more data center load of all kinds, an effect that's neither really wholesale markets or retail markets, but maybe some kind of other thing? Or do you expect it to translate prices to the retail customer the same as traditionally?
Yeah. So there's a couple of things wrapped up in there. I've sort of mentioned the three blobs of electricity service, right? It's the supply, it's the big poles and wires of transmission, small poles and wires of distribution. In ERCOT, how we allocate those big poles and wires costs, those transmission costs, I have argued and will continue to argue is not an appropriate allocation and overly weights the costs to residential consumers. And that has little chance of being resolved anytime soon. So now, historically, the transmission portion of a total bill was small. The arguments 20 years ago were, we need to spend more on transmission, we're gonna spend dimes to save dollars. Well, now we're starting to sort of spend, quarters at least on transmission and the prices, the supply prices on those have declined as well. So we're starting to spend quarters to maybe, also save quarters on the supply side. And those trade-offs, because we've separated, have become harder to make. The trade-offs have been harder to see, let me say it that way. What I'm concerned by in terms of if I'm in, big data centers, and there's this evolving thinking about, well, there's data centers that are just, consuming 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. And then there's what look like data centers because they're just big computers, Bitcoin or digital coin miners that are that have the ability to stop consuming at certain times. Those are two different things. And my concern is that will overinvest infrastructure to support loads that won't need that infrastructure investment. And the costs of that are most likely going to be borne by residential consumers. That's the Beth Garza opinion, and that's where I'm at right now.
Anything?
I'm also interested to see, certainly here in Texas, talking about kind of big users of electricity. In Texas, we've had a very, very powerful and strong and big influence. I've been asked if it's an outsized influence. I don't know that it's outsized, but it's certainly large, reflective of their role in the market. Industrial consumers are a big force in the economy and electricity supply in Texas. And when I talk about traditional industrial consumers, chemical plants, refineries, oil and gas processing, things with steam and pipes and that kind of stuff. And what we're seeing now, what I think we're seeing is a growing large consumer class that's bits and bytes and and cooling, data warehousing. And I think the needs and requirements of those two types of sources may be different. Haven't seen any obvious clashes yet, but that's something I'm looking out for.
I'll go to that.
I'm just curious what you think of the idea of the distribution system operator shepherding local energy technologies.
I think I've given that some thought, and as I think about the evolution of smaller scale resources, household level kinds of things, and how I draw parallels to what happened at what I call the transmission or wholesale level, right? Industrial consumers needed more reliability than their utility could provide, so they have on-site generation to back them up. And they were big things, so they had big power plants, and they could find synergies with steam, so they became cogeneration plants and all of that, right? That existed, and that then morphed into our wholesale, the transmission organization. At the distribution level, as we get more and more of that kinds of resources, right? It's just smaller customers reacting to the same concerns. The grid isn't providing the reliability that I want. I'm going to put a power wall on, or I'm going to figure out how to, power my house from my lightning truck, or all of those various types of things. How are they managed? And I don't know the answer. I'm not sure it's a separate distribution, ISO. I've made the assertion, much to the ERCOT folks' chagrin, at some point I could see a future where this distinction we make between big poles and wires and small poles and wires go away. And it's just wires. And it's everything from the 12 kV at your house to, the 345 or even 765 kV that we have coming. And all of that is managed at an organization. In Texas, it would be easy, because that would be managed at an organization like ERCOT. Those are my thoughts. I don't know that it can materialize that way, and for it to materialize that way requires, an advancement in the management, the systems necessary we can manage that big data. It's the interaction of that big data to people that would have to make decisions, or systems that would be configured in a way to make decisions. That's the part I'm less confident in.
I think that answers my question.
Okay.
DERs as grid support.
Yeah. It's easy when it's just, customer here, customer there. It's slop in the system. It's rounding error that's not noticeable. And I don't have a good feel for when does it become an issue that warrants, paying more attention to. But at some point, if half the customers have devices that are doing things, and then part of it comes from what are what are the systems, what are the control systems, what's the software driving those decisions? And is it all the same and reacting the same? One anecdote on that is, as battery storage and ERCOT has become a bigger and more important aspect of the supply mix. And early days for batteries was easy because they would just make their money off of ancillary services. I'll be charged up. I'll sit here charged up. You tell me if you want my energy. That works fine and good until there's too many of those they swamp the ancillary service market. So then you have to figure out, well, how do I buy energy low and sell it high? Which, people do that all the time in financial markets. How do I buy low, sell high? And interestingly, there's been a little bit of evidence that you saw a bunch of battery systems owned by different people that were moving in the same pattern. And it's because they were using the same software telling them when to buy and sell. And so, from a market monitoring perspective, it raised an interesting question in terms of none of the parties had market power, but they were using the same software, and so they were all moving together then that had, the inclination of a market impact.
All right, we'll end on this one here, which is maybe a short answer. You discussed, I guess, some use of whatever the correct term in Texas revenue surplus to have low cost loans for effectively natural gas power. And obviously, we have federal tax incentives for renewables that influence generation in Texas.
Sure.
And you talk about RTOs cross boundaries. So Texas is still part of the United States, and ERCOT that gets affected by this. So that's a long entry into. Somebody's question: can we really say that any of the restructured markets are truly competitive? No such thing as a free market, and we just have to figure out our favorite hybrid, different hybrid than we had on board.
Well, yeah, I hear that argument all the time. We just need to get rid of all the subsidies, and let the market be what the market be. In reality, we talk about deregulation. I'm going to answer with my take on the interactions between sort of policy, regulation, and markets. And policy and regulation, in my mind, define the cage match, or the cage within the fight takes place, the competitive arena, if you will. What is the arena within which people are competing? And so it's not the Wild West where everybody does whatever they want to do. The role for policy and regulation is to define, you have to operate within this sphere, this area. If you go outside the area, that's not allowed. You can't bring a gun to the knife fight, or whatever the rules are, right? And those that, if it's a knife fight, then the best knife fighter is going to win. If it's the lowest cost energy, the person who's the most, has the highest expectation of the lowest price is going to win. So that's my take on it. People have made those arguments for years. And from a Texas perspective, my reaction, I'll look in the camera to whoever maybe submitted that. My reaction to folks who argue about the federal subsidies and you just need to get rid of those, I'm like, from a Texas perspective, why would we? We're like getting the benefit of all these other people's money to lower our electricity price. This is the tax, the production tax credit in particular. That's federal tax money flowing here for our benefit. Why would we argue against that? The oil and gas guys don't do it for their preferential, accounting treatment. So
I'd argue, I make an additional statement that's actually not tax revenue that funds tax credits. It's just a decision to spend by the federal government. They can create money by spending, and Texas can't. So
that's a difference.
clear distinction.
Okay.
All right. So let's thank our speaker today.
Thank you.